Once again, welcome to Coffee with EMBL, and especially to this festive edition of Coffee with EMBL. It's remarkable, I say this, it's always remarkable to me just how many of these we've managed to do already, but we're today celebrating the 27th Coffee with EMBL, so I think that's a huge success. And to anyone who's joining for the first time, a very warm welcome, and to everyone else, welcome back. It's great to see old friends and new friends here. Just before we start, I'd like to invite Matthias to say a few words.
Okay, I guess this also now follows a certain tradition because unfortunately I don't manage to join every Coffee with EMBL. But at least the Christmas edition, I try to. It's a particularly nice one. It's a great opportunity to say thank you. It would take too long to thank everyone for whom there is a reason to be thankful to. But I would like to thank Angus and Thomas in particular as the generous hosts who organize the coffees with EMBL every time, and maybe also sort of on behalf of all the guests that help with the program, I thank this time the three main contributors. I look forward to that discussion. I think it's a great topic for before Christmas. And then I also would like to thank very much, of course, the Alumni Relations team that is doing such a magnificent job, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure you all feel well taken care of, and if you don't, please drop me a note. But in any case, I wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and all the best for the next year, which hopefully will be a special year for every one of you. It will certainly also be a very special year for EMBL. It's the year of EMBL's 50th anniversary. We have a few little surprises in store for that year, so we hope that you will follow that with some interest, and that you will stay particularly connected during that year and find a way to celebrate with us. So all the very best for 2024 as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. And we are all looking forward to the 50th anniversary of EMBL and to continuing to support the laboratory and your mission for European, and not just European, but world science. So we have a really exciting topic, I think, today, something I've been greatly looking forward to. We're going to be discussing and talking about scientific publishing. And we've got a really interesting set of guest speakers who have all published books and who are able to share with us their experience about the publication process. And I think one of the very interesting things from reading these books is just how varied they are in the style of writing, in the audiences they're addressing. And I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. I do wonder how many other people in the audience have either written a book already or have plans to write a book. So if you have either written a book or have plans to write one, please do put it in the chat and mention it. We would love to hear about that. Nush assures me that the EMBL library purchases books from all alumni who write books, and I believe that's a true statement. So you're guaranteed a readership. And I think that journey of planning and creating a book is a very exciting one that I'm looking forward to learning more about today. We actually have 4 members of the alumni who have written books who we're hoping to speak with today. And I'd just like to invite them each to just briefly introduce themselves so we all know who everyone is. So Anna, could we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Angus. So nice seeing you all. So I was predoc at EMBL and starting from 2008 to 2012, and the group of Michael Knop. So this was yeast research mainly. And currently I am a senior project manager in one of the biotech companies in Poland, in Krakow, precisely. Yes, I'm an author of a book which was first published in Poland, and this is the original, and then it was translated to German. So that's why we are meeting today, because you can also read this book in Germany. And there are also Ukrainian, South Korean, and Spanish editions. So we are broadening up.
Great, thank you very much. And Alvis?
I am at EMBL since 1997. I'm a senior scientist, and I have been all this time at the European Bioinformatics Institute in Kingston. And that actually is why I wrote the book. I had been originally trained as a mathematician, and this was my transition from a mathematician to a biologist, which had not been completed in all these 30 years. I'm not sure I will manage to complete it before I retire.
Thank you very much. And Russ?
Hi, so I was hired the same year Alvis came in 1997 by EMBL to start the Office of Information and Public Affairs. And I'm not quite sure why they hired me. I was a writer. I felt like a writer. I'd wanted to be a writer my whole life. And I had this great opportunity because neither EMBL nor I quite knew what we were doing at the time. And so I sort of found my way into science. I don't have any background in molecular biology, but I fumbled my way into science writing. And I think it was a great opportunity because there were no rules, basically. And so I could do things any way I wanted to and try to do it very rationally. And it turned out to be pretty successful. When I left EMBL, I moved to the Max Delbrück Center in Berlin, where I could write also. I wrote 2 books about that institute. And I've written, I think, 12 books now. I'm writing another one. And half of them came from a publisher in the United States, a request. And then I've written also dozens of institutional reports for like I did for EMBL when I was there. Yeah, okay. So that's me.
Fantastic. And then last but not least, Andrew.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm a biochemist, cell molecular biologist, and structural biologist. And I did my PhD and postdoc at the LMB in Cambridge. And then I joined EMBO, where I was the manager for the Science and Society program. So developing actions for communicating science with the public and helping researchers communicate their science. And I also became an editor of EMBO reports at that time. So when my time at EMBO was up, the 9 years, I was well equipped to get an editorial position with the publisher Wiley as the editor-in-chief of the journal Bioessays, where I stayed for 13 years. And then I thought, well, it's time to go freelance. The pressures of publishing and the tensions there were not really to my liking anymore. And so I became a freelance communications coach and writer. And that gave me the opportunity to concentrate more on the book, which is this one, The Decarbonisation Delusion. And that took 3 years of my time and was a very interesting experience.
Thank you. And I'm sure, like the other guests, available at all good bookstores and the perfect Christmas gift for anyone considering it. Thank you very much. So, Anna, then, if we could come back to you, it would be great if you could briefly describe the focus of your book for the people in the audience who haven't read it. I've been reading this week the German version of it, but it's interesting that you originally wrote it in Polish, I take it, and it's been translated into other languages. And perhaps we can come back to discuss that whole issue of translation and how the message is affected by it. But please just tell us the story of how your book came about.
Thank you. So the book was actually commissioned by a publishing house based on my previous experience in writing about science, popularizing science, and writing about science for a weekly magazine we have in Poland. It's focused on politics, science, culture. It's kind of very broad topics, but there's always a column on science there, where from time to time I have opportunity to write about news in the field. And the publishing house contacted me asking whether I could write a book on the history of medicine for children, age 10 to 12. And it was really a challenge because I never before wrote anything, any article or longer piece for children. And also it was a challenge because the publishing house was expecting a book on a history, but which would not be chronological. So they wanted the author to have an idea how to tackle this history of medicine, but not being boring for children. So then we went through several rounds of ideas and discussions how this could look like. And finally, we came to a conclusion on a draft, in which I divided the history of medicine into several areas like anatomy, physiology, modern medicine, immunology, and then describe more into detail the history of these areas. And then, of course, since it's a book for kids, so then we also, the very important part of this book are illustrations. So this was also done by a very skilled person with whom we also had to interact and discuss some of the illustrations, whether they capture well what's in the text. Yeah, the challenge was to write for the children, and also the challenge was to dig deep into the history of medicine and bring out the most interesting stories, because that's also what's interesting for me, how the discoveries were made, what experiments led to discoveries, what led to our current knowledge. So this was.
Yeah, I thought you did a great job in putting the historical context in an accessible way. So congratulations. I have to say, I'm not a child anymore. I'm maybe heading for a second childhood, but I certainly learned from it and enjoyed it. I also liked the illustrations, and so this was interesting. The cat and the dog illustrations were beautiful. Perhaps you could tell us about how they came about, or how you worked with an illustrator to put the ideas across.
Well, with the cats and dogs, it was quite a funny history, because the illustrator was a cat person. She is a cat person, and I'm more a dog person. So in the beginning, on most of the illustrations, there were only cats, and I asked her to introduce some dogs because I was also a part of this book. And then the dogs appeared and the Freud's dog. She had this very good idea to introduce the dogs that were working together with Sigmund Freud, and also I have this at the very end, the picture of me with my dog. Actually, I can't find it at the last page. Yes, here. So this is me with my dog at that time. Yeah. So and also we never met with the illustrator. We actually, this was more coordinated by the publishing house, but I think she had a very good understanding of science, and she kept the illustrations interesting and not really like in a book for school that you would have. So keeping the story, but also introducing some additional information. That was also important for me.
How did you go about designing the book? I mean, I wouldn't know how to start writing a book for children. Did you read a lot of other books about health or science designed for children to get some ideas, or did you just decide to do it from first principles?
No, I just sat down, I started writing. I didn't really, I went through several books, but on completely other topics. And on purpose, I didn't read any medical science books for children, because I didn't want to be influenced by others. And so I thought that the best would be just to start and just to have a draft, and then broaden up the different parts, and try to find as much information that would be interesting for children, especially from Middle Ages, ancient times, when maybe it's not like a knowledge that we have in everyday life, and also to introduce knowledge from my everyday life, so more from molecular biology, from immunology, so also to have this combination of modern biology and also the history. That was the aim. So yeah, maybe I didn't approach it like very scientifically. I just thought, okay, let's just start.
Okay, interesting. And have you had a chance to get much feedback from children who've read the book? Or question?
I get some feedback, and it was good feedback. I know these people, and I know these children, so I don't know if it was real. But I also read comments on the internet web pages for this book, and they are in general good. Sometimes people write that it's too specialistic, yeah, too difficult for children. So maybe in some parts it might be too tough, but sometimes people write that it's more for adults than for children. But yeah,
I think most of the topics you were addressing would be of interest to adults, and it's quite a remarkable story, the evolution of understanding in human history of many of these things. And I think most adults who don't have a formal medical or biological training would not be familiar with most of the things you were saying. So I did wonder whether you had any plans to bring out an edition of, or an updated version of the book actually aimed at telling the same story for adults who maybe wouldn't feel comfortable reading a book with the pictures that look more as if it's designed for children. Have you thought about making a version for adults?
Actually not. I was thinking about another book for children on a slightly different topic, but also connected with science. But no, I didn't think I was a bit discouraged by the publishing house, who told me that after pandemic, the interest in popular science books dropped a lot, especially in the medical field, because people were so overwhelmed. They heard a lot during pandemic about viruses, about different medicines, that they are just completely fed up with the topic. So they advised me to wait some time with maybe writing another book when the market will be also more open to such topics.
Okay, and a question I think we'll also discuss with the other authors today, Anna, but with your book also, clearly it's a book that you wrote in one language, in Polish, and then it was translated to German, and you say now also to Spanish or to other languages. How did you find that process, and how much were you engaged with the translation? I mean, I don't know which of these languages you're a native or a fluent speaker in after translation, but obviously if it was translated to a language, I don't know, I'm guessing Arabic or something that maybe you don't speak fluently, it's hard to know how accurately the translator has conveyed your story. How did you find that experience of translation?
So actually, this is the Korean book, South Korean edition. And this one is Ukrainian. So I can't speak both of the languages, and as you can see, they are also both in completely different alphabets. So I was always, after the book was first I was informed by the publishing house that there will be a translation of the book, and then I was receiving, sometimes there were some minor changes just to adapt the book to the country. For there's I think one or two changes also in the German edition. But then they all were also sending me the whole text and asking if I accept it. And yeah, of course, I speak German, and I can read German, so this one I could read. But all the others, and also including Spanish and all the other languages which are completely not known to me, I just couldn't. I can't tell if it was well translated or not.
Could you have a dialogue, at least with the German translator? So I can read the German version, but I didn't see, and I don't speak Polish, so I couldn't know how accurately that was reflecting what you wrote. Do you feel happy that the translation was accurate?
I think that it was accurate, although it sounds like more difficult. But maybe it's because for me it's just not my native language. But I think that it's an accurate translation.
Okay, thanks.
So I actually have a question for Anna, because I was thinking, being kids, I mean, usually the norm is kids are even harder to convince to read. So I was wondering whether, the type of format, of course, illustration books for kids, okay, but the type of format, especially in the writing, was something that you came up with, something that was mandated by the publisher. How did you settle on a certain type of narration?
So I was completely free to write whatever I wanted. Okay. So they were not influencing what was written. Only the content of the book was checked by a person who specializes in school children psychology, so that there is no no parts which can be too difficult for children and at that age. But there were no such parts. I was not explaining in the detail how the anatomy was dissected, so it was fine. But otherwise they were not influencing what would be written.
Okay. And how did you go about describing things that you were actually not knowing? I guess, I mean, maybe a lot of what you were writing about you had to find out and research for yourself. Did you exchange a lot with medical doctors? Did you have like pointers for things that you needed to dig out and you wanted to write about?
So I did a lot of literature research and read several really thick books on history of medicine which are out there for adults, like really that thick. And also searched a lot on the internet, some interesting tales also from the old times, and also I consulted with one of the friends that I have here in Krakow, who is also passionate about history of medicine. So he also shared a lot of stories with me, which I didn't know, and I could then broaden the knowledge in the books and then bring it back to children.
Well, Anna, congratulations. I mean, I think writing books for kids is even more difficult than writing for adults. Although I relate with Angus' comments before that actually, there's a lot of more adults that have an understanding of these things that are basically the ones of kids. So I'm sure that, adults as well enjoy your book. So now I wanted to bring in the second guest that we have, who is Alvis, to tell us about his book. His book has to do with information and how information is encoded into life, I guess. So I think it's a very fascinating topic. I have to say that at this point, I'm super curious about the book. I probably I will receive a copy, but I haven't read it. So this is a disclaimer. So I'll leave you the stage and I'll leave you to describe what it is about. And then we can discuss a few points about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Thomas, for this introduction. So first of all, listening to Anna, I must say, I can safely say my book is very different, really, and my story of the book is very different. And I really admire Anna for writing for children. I don't think I've ever been able to do that. I will never attempt that. Yeah. So my book, yeah, can yeah. So Zoom doesn't it really has been meant for people who are already interested in science and largely keeping in mind my fellow scientists, but perhaps also more general audience, but people who really have kind of a high school education, so not for children, definitely not for children. Yeah, so how I got to writing that, I think also is very different, really. So as I mentioned, I was trained as a mathematician. Although I had always been interested in biology, I really started becoming a proper biologist only when I joined the EMBL in '97. And I still think as a mathematician. So this has been kind of long transition from mathematician to a biologist, which has never really been completed. And all this time, as I was kind of learning more and more about biology, I thought that biology anyway is about information processing. And then one day, must have been about 10 years ago, when I started drafting my book, that's another difference. It has been a very long process, but of course not full-time job and on and off. And Sidney Brenner wrote a column, I think in Science or in Nature, one of these big journals, where he said, biology basically is physics with information processing. And then I thought, well, that's exactly my idea. And I was worried for all this time that he actually will write first that book, and he will scoop me. But then I guess he had better things to do, yeah, than writing a book. So in that sense, I think I was safe. He wrote a couple of short articles about this, what I could find, but nothing more substantial, really. So and finally, I think a big difference is that I had a pretty solid draft time I approached the publishers. And I did it conscientiously. I knew that it might have been easier to contact the publishers first and find out what they want. But I wanted my idea really to be presented the way I wanted it. And I didn't want any publisher to derail me from kind of presenting it the way I wanted it. And also the idea that it really is for my peers has been always on my mind. So basically, one of the main theses in the book is that life and information emerge together, and that there is no life without information, and arguably there is no information without life. But for most of the 3-4 billion years since life exists on Earth, most of the information, non-redundant information on Earth, has been stored in DNA, and it has been processed through the Darwinian algorithm of genetic algorithm of the survival of the fittest. But then, just about 100,000 years ago, which is just a moment, on the evolutionary time scale ago, the human language emerged, and this began changing. And now, arguably, the information is growing faster in world's libraries and computer clouds than in all the genomes of the whole species on Earth. Nevertheless, at the current stage of evolution, the information in DNA is underpinning all that. If the DNA on Earth would get seriously corrupted, then all the cultural information, all the other information will disappear pretty soon with the life itself. But then the question is, must life be like this? Or will there be another evolutionary transition with the information in DNA becoming less important? Earth is well past its midlife. Yeah, so the solar system was formed more than 4 billion years ago, but it's only about 1 billion left. until the solar system will become uninhabitable. So to preserve and to continue all the information collected by civilization, the life somehow will have to change, or will have to be transported somewhere else. Will we have to transport the DNA, or perhaps some other way of preserving the civilization and the information on which it's based will be possible? So note that according to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, every galactic civilization passes through 3 different phases. Yeah, how, why, where phases? I would say before life as DNA, and life after DNA.
Yeah, so I haven't read the book, obviously, but a lot of what you were talking about in the last part, so I mean, how do you disengage information from DNA? Well, I mean, I guess one thing must be that now we have technology and we have machines, and the information is propagating this way. So you go from language to information technology, I guess. So is it something you explore in the book? And if not, I mean, would you comment about this, especially now that, you know, machines are becoming kind of pro at elaborating information, right?
Yeah, so I touch it in the last 2 chapters. The thing is that it really is largely, I could refer to Geoffrey Hinton, who said that possibly the humans are only passing stage in the evolution of intelligence. Yeah, and I kind of touch it a little bit. Since this is a speculation, I didn't want to go too much into this. What I really wanted is to equip the reader with the knowledge to be able to think about these questions more than to try to give any answers. I don't have.
And the other aspect is that, I mean, you've been so passionate about writing a book, and it seems it's been so long into making. So I mean, you explain a lot the how, but I mean the strong motivation and the why to write a book. What was it? Was it because books have been inspiration to become a scientist in the first place, and you wanted to give back, or what is the why?
Yeah. So first of all, you know, I had always loved myself reading popular science books since childhood, since I can remember. Really, I think that's partly because of that I became scientist. So there was kind of this idea of paying back. That I actually have an idea that what I wanted to tell and perhaps how to go about this, that came to me also many years ago when I read one of the kind of the best popular sciences book what I know, which I tried to some extent emulate, which was Roger Penrose's Emperor's New Mind. I was just kind of escaped Soviet Union. I was in desert of New Mexico, and I joined the book club there, I remember, and you get 3 books for free when you join it. Yeah, I think after I got these 3 books for free, I left the club. Yeah, but one of these 3 books was Penrose's Emperor's New Mind. At that point, I read it superficially, but then what happened is, yeah, I was about 10 years ago, I was in Zermatt trying to climb Matterhorn. But it was very bad summer. It was raining, and basically there was no chance, really. But I had that very copy of the book with me. So I read it at that point very carefully. And that's when this idea came to my mind. The Penrose's book is effectively physics and computation. I thought we need physics, computation, and biology. And that's where this idea started kind of growing. And one more thing what I can say is I've been mountaineer. That's why I also wanted to climb Matterhorn, which actually I did a few years later after that. And one of the attractions of climbing mountains is when you are on top. First of all, you know, it's an effort, just like writing a book. And then when the book comes out and then you see this, yeah, then that's like being on the top of the mountain. But what is even more important, I think, what I always liked about climbing mountains, when you are on the top, then you see the context around you. You see others. Yeah, when you climb Matterhorn, it's a fantastic view on Mont Blanc, for instance, yeah, which is many miles away, really. Yeah, and this I think is similar to in science. When I'm doing my own research, I've always been interested in the context, in wider context, and that's what really kind of led to this drive to write a book. So how do I put what I'm doing into the wider context?
Into the context. I mean, yeah, and I guess this is a great exercise, because in writing a book like this, I think, you know, it requires a lot of, I guess, perspective thinking, because you want to lay out a fairly complex argument. So you probably want to really sit on the top of the mountain. Well, I mean, I can only attest that normally in summer I'm on the other side of the Matterhorn in Cervinia, and when it's raining, the only thing I do is sit down and I eat. So in your case, I mean, you're doing much more proficient job. So
I was eating a lot too. I was eating a lot too. Yeah. Normally, when you go to mountains, you lose weight. I think, and that summer I gained.
Okay, so that's great. So no, congratulations on the book. I mean, this description made me even more want to buy it and read it. So I will do so if I don't receive it from Heidelberg.
If I could say, Thomas, I can highly recommend you reading the book. I've been really enjoying reading it, at least in part because a lot of the things Alvis is talking about relate to the fundamental question in biology, as I see it, is what actually does life mean? What is a living system, and what's the difference between animate and inanimate system, and what's the minimum required to constitute an animate system? And so it's a hugely thought-provoking book, and I'd like to congratulate and thank Alvis for writing it. Even if it's kept me awake at night, because after reading a chapter, I can't then go to sleep because I'm thinking about the questions that he's raised. One question I'd like to ask you, Alvis, however, is, in writing this, you must have had in mind who were you speaking to? Were you speaking to other scientists? I guess you were, because my impression, and I don't mean this as a criticism, but my impression is it may be slightly difficult for people without a certain level of scientific knowledge to fully appreciate your book. I just wondered how you approached that idea of who you wanted to communicate your message to.
Yeah, well, I did keep my peers in mind. These are the people I've been kind of talking to, and I know what is interesting for them. I don't know whether you got that impression. That would be interesting to hear it from you or from somebody else. I tried to start every chapter in a way that for kind of for the few 10 pages, it could be easy reading for more or less everybody. So that's one of the recommendations, even if you are not a scientist, I hope you will enjoy the book, but when you start reading, when you get into the chapter later and you get stuck, just go to the next chapter. I think that was kind of one of the things which I actually kind of tried to stick to. So.
Yeah, and well, anyway, I really hope we can find a time to meet up, Alvis, and I can discuss the book with you in more detail if you'd be willing to do that. But this topic we just raised, if I could bring in Russ at the moment, it's interesting that so far we've talked with two people who were scientists who then decided to go down the path of becoming writers. I think it would be fair to say that you had the inverse journey of being a writer who got into science and medicine. Could you perhaps share your journey with us?
Sure, and actually that's very interesting. So it's true. I had absolutely no training in molecular biology or even the hard sciences. My background was in psychology and linguistics because I wanted to understand how my own mind worked, and I wanted to understand how language worked because I was going to be a writer. And I think what I'll do is I want to show you a book I wrote a few years ago, which kind of brings a lot of these themes together. And you'll see, I'm going to read like a page and a half of it just to kind of show you something. I've always thought a couple of things. The first thing is that I think that it only is good if scientific writing becomes more like literature or other types of writing. There's several reasons for that I'll talk about, but and by that I don't mean to make it simpler, but I mean that I really do believe it's possible to write for both scientists and the public in a way that both of them will accept. And I guess my kind of whole career has been revolved around writing things that scientists actually like, but other people can understand too. So this is a really interesting, I'm going to share my screen if I can. Oops, somebody has to allow me to do that first.
Okay, Rory can give you permission.
Yep, I got it. Now, sometimes my internet blips out, so if that happens, be patient. I'll be right back. So this book was extremely interesting because when I left EMBL, I'd been writing the annual reports, and I'd been trying to take a different approach to annual reports to make them much more interesting and literary. And then I went to Berlin and I wrote a big book on the campus, which was, I think it was only when I did that I really understood what I was doing. And that was, there are very few, we live in a small slice of science, of scientific time. And things change very quickly. If you talk to students nowadays, you'll hear things like, yes, AI and single cell sequencing and artificial intelligence and phase separation. And these are themes that have just like come up over the last couple of years, and students don't have a historical perspective on things. And so I discovered that what I was trying to do with these reports was to look at how scientists were thinking in a given year about all kinds of different problems. And when I arrived in Berlin, I had suddenly arrived at a molecular medicine institute. I didn't know what that was. So I wrote 25 stories about projects that were going on, how people were thinking, how they were using the technologies, the types of models they were using. And in that process, I discovered one story which I thought was fascinating because it had been failing and failing and failing for almost 3 decades. So I'm going to I'll read the beginning of the story to kind of set the stage, and then we'll go back and I'll talk a little bit about why this was so interesting to me and what came of it and why it was kind of important at all. So I got to design this book. I've been very fortunate that in my entire career, I could control all of the design, and I wanted this to kind of be an adventure story because for me, it was an adventure story. And I'll just read about 1.5 pages of it to kind of get you into the idea. This is the story of a group of researchers searching for the causes of one of mankind's most deadly diseases. It is simultaneously the story of a Turkish family with a unique hereditary condition. A defect in their DNA gives them short fingers and toes, which is trivial, but also gives them extraordinarily high blood pressure that brings sudden death at an early age. 50 years ago, a family member set off to find a doctor who could shed light on his family's health problems. In doing so, he touched off a biomedical drama that's reached across the world and shed new light on the relationship between information in our DNA and disease. Most science stories revolve around a mystery, and this tale has more elements of that genre than most. Multiple deaths, a quest for answers that's lasted more than 50 years, a cast of characters colorful to the point of eccentricity, and the application of cutting-edge technology to a sophisticated puzzle. Appropriately enough, there were a few incidents involving firearms and almost a prison break. Over a century ago, sudden death began disrupting the peaceful existence of a family of farmers living on the Black Sea coast. Initially, its selection of victims seemed random, but in the early 1960s, the family noticed a pattern and sought the help of scientists in discovering its causes. 30 years later, a physician and researcher named Fred Luft sank his teeth into the story and, like the best literary detectives, refused to let go. At the time, he had no idea that the project might one day reveal a new mechanism by which disease arises in our cells and bodies, or that it would require over 2 decades to find. It hasn't been easy going, despite continual revolutions in biotechnology and scientists' understanding of the roles that genes play in health and disease. The answer to the puzzle has remained elusive. The lab has thrown nearly every new method and technology at the problem, but it always seems to dance away again, teasing them along. Anyone sensible would have been forgiven for abandoning the project long ago. That surely would have happened without an unusual amount of persistence on the part of the scientist and also extraordinary efforts on the part of the family in Turkey. So this is the story about the human side of research, in particular about a man who's continued to inspire and motivate colleagues and students despite opportunities for frustration at every turn. This case is a what done it rather than a who done it, with ripe pickings for a storyteller, In the early years, it was cited as an exceptional attempt at what is now called molecular medicine. But there's never been any guarantee that the ultimate answer to the riddle would be very meaningful or interesting. And 3 years ago, when the research for this book began, a definitive answer to the family's health problems was still missing, which made it a mystery story without a final chapter. Yeah, so that it goes on from there. But this, so what I mean by bringing literature into science is so much more than papers. It's so much more than results. It's about changes in models. It's about failures. It's about failures. And this story is such a good parable of everything that's happened in the last 30 years in biomedicine because it failed. So every new technology that came along, they tried to throw into this. Every new concept, microRNAs, circular RNAs, everything, they just tried and nothing worked. And to me, that made it more interesting, but it's not the kind of story you will find told about science in those other places. And just as the last thing, I told Fred I wanted to write this book. He said, okay, we'll go back to Turkey. So we packed everything together. We went back to Turkey, found the family, got samples for them. And based on those samples, they were actually able to finally solve the problem 5 years ago. And so he made me an author on the Nature Genetics paper. It was the first of, I think, 12 papers that I'm an author on without any scientific background. I thought that was pretty cool. So I don't see these genres or these these ways of thinking as being different from each other. There's a lot of communication in science, and you can also bring science into communication, which is something that I've been very interested in for the past 10 years now. Okay.
Thank you, Russ, and thanks for reading. And again, I would really like to encourage or recommend to everyone listening the book Russ mentioned. I've had the privilege of reading.
Sorry, I just lost you. Hopefully you'll come back.
Can you hear? Can you hear me, Thomas?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, maybe it's Russ.
It's more Russ.
I can't hear anything, so I'm just waiting and hope. Okay, you're back now.
Okay,
The last.
I think it was you who dipped out, Russ, but hopefully your connection stays. I was just recommending your book and saying how much I've been enjoying reading it. It's clear that it's talking about science, but it's also a human interest story. I also recognized, although I wasn't familiar with the story you were describing of the link between short digits and hypertension, in my own research, I recently been working on Huntington's disease. And in that field, it's also a very, very interesting story. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where the gene for Huntington's disease was tracked down thanks to particular families in South America who helped to actually map the gene. There's a lot of human interest there. And I agree, it completely transforms your thinking about science to have that engagement with the human interest of doing it. And I just wondered on if you might share some of your perspectives from working with a lot of scientists about whether scientists who come in to try to write, if their background and the focus on so much of their writing will have been trained in a certain style that demands rigor and precision rather than communication more broadly. I wonder if the art of communication is actually inhibited by that background training.
So scientists, most of the writing and most of the presentations that scientists are exposed to are just bad. And they're bad not because they're trying to be super technical or it's just because people haven't thought about it, or they're repeating fossils from that they've heard. They have this idea in their mind that there's a thing called a scientific style, and that style has a lot of little words. And I wrote a whole book called The Devil's Dictionary of Scientific Words and Phrases because I was so irritated by this. If you take any present, so the moment that I was started to write at EMBL about science, I was also asked to teach scientists to write. And I found myself in a bewildering, confusing situation where the problems I was seeing, they didn't make any sense. There didn't seem to be any logic to it. So over the last 15 years, I spent the last 15 years taking this apart and putting this together because the real problem was there were these weird gaps in logic when people are writing about their own work or talking about their own work. They don't see the whole. They don't see it at different levels of abstraction. They're too much on the ground. But you can analyze this, and what you find is that scientists, you see a lot of cognitive confusion in science. And that cognitive confusion comes from just, you have this thing that I call the inner laboratory. Every scientist has one, builds one, and it's just a big mess in there. And you can actually use, if you train people to write or to give talks in a sort of with a model behind it, you can clean up that cognitive confusion and you can actually improve the research. So I think there's no way to write clearly if you don't think clearly. And so if you see somebody's writing that's a mess, it means that there's something up here. And so if you have to write for the public, or if you have to explain something very simply to someone, it forces you to go up there and rethink the way that you're doing things, the patterns that you're using, the way things are connected in your mind. And so this has become a really powerful sort of concept in trying to help people. And it's the same process that you would use if you were going to write a popular book about science, or even if you needed to write just a clear scientific report. You have to go in and see what that structure of ideas is. And so I've done a lot of work on this, and anybody who's interested can get in touch with me about this, because we really are fixing people's science as well as just by making them to write for different audiences, for example.
I definitely am hoping to follow up with you on this, because certainly one of my own experiences is constantly being surprised in my own case, in my colleagues' case, in trying to engage with people, not even people with a non-scientific background, sometimes even people who you think ought to have at least a basic degree of scientific understanding, and my colleagues' inability to properly see the story through the eyes of the other person, because it constantly make assumptions about what vocabulary and visual concepts something conveys to them. And I mean, it's not, and you discover
I spend most of my time writing about science really trying to look at something and saying, what is the pattern in this person's mind that I need to, and then what are the patterns that I have and what are the patterns that other people have? Because that's how we learn things, is by mapping them onto familiar patterns. And so first you need to identify them. So, but this point that you made about sort of, I mean, every project these days could have a technologist, could have a medical doctor in it. It could have a molecular biologist. It could have somebody from a company in it. You've just got to be, and so I've seen 100 group meetings where there were people in the same group who didn't understand each other. And it's just bad. So the way to get around this is, first of all, to understand those kinds of problems. But secondly, to really, it's really worth making the effort to communicate with all kinds of different people, because it forces you to go into your own head and say, okay, what is it in this pattern that I can use the other people's patterns to map onto?
Yeah,
and it's a very complex process that we could talk about a long time, but
yeah, and I actually hope this is something that we can perhaps build on with the alumni community, because I mean, just looking at the people online today, and many of the friends and colleagues I've met through the community have so much important, valuable things to communicate, and just giving the correct tools to be able to communicate that to a wider, more diverse audience, I think would be a huge gift. And I would love, I have several ideas for books that I've never managed. I'm not competent and not skillful enough to deliver. I still harbor the ambition that one day perhaps I could. And I hope that by, with some instruction from an expert like yourself, it would help me to be confident enough to try that.
Let me just say just two or more things really quickly. So there's a process that you can go through that will get you ready to write for any audience. And the rest of it has to do with really liking the process of sitting in front of a blank page and solving you have to like language. Language, I mean, I wanted to read also because I wanted to show that when I write, I have to be able to read aloud everything I say. It has to be melodic. It has to be interesting. It has to be shaped in a good way. The sentences can't be too long. You have to kind of learn to write like you read. or read like you write, and vice versa. But the other thing is you really have to enjoy that problem of sitting in front of a blank page and summoning a story out of nothing, and solving. Writing is having a feel for language and solving little puzzles as you go along, so that you construct a whole thing. And if you like those two things, then you can be a writer, I think. And okay, it's good to have a few conversations ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, I must say, I love spoken language, and I love the sound of it. And it might sound strange, but I like to just recite bits of text or poetry that particularly capture my mind. And I feel something that sounds good. That's also why I think I enjoy audiobooks also today, with a good, the same book read by different people feels like a completely different book. I do wonder to what extent you feel writing is a different art if you're writing expecting someone to read it out loud, because
so I write a lot of speeches for my new boss, and you really do have to learn that written language and spoken language is fundamentally different. It's fine. So when I write, I just read it and I hear it in my head, but it is different because we process language differently. In a speech, you can't go back and reread something. If the sentence gets too complicated, then you lose track. But English is set up in general to be pretty linear, so that you kind of, each sentence tells a story. It starts someplace, it goes someplace else, it ends someplace. Then you can pick things up exactly at the next place. And German is not like that, for example. German, you have to process the entire sentence before you can understand it. And then you have to go to the next sentence and process all of that. And so this is, you asked about translations earlier. So I'm working now with a German translator because my next book already has a German publisher. And I was amazed to find out that there, in translator school, you learn a rule that sentence boundaries have to stay the same between, for example, English and German. You just can't do it. I mean, if you have any feeling for the language, or if you care about that side of it. But the last thing is, I'm always kind of surprised, because I think most people that you meet in terms of trying to write, they don't have a really good feel for the fact that language is power, language is beauty, language is seduction. And all of that starts with clarity. All of that starts with being able to communicate something. And it's the problems that scientists have communicating with other people, it's not because they know more facts than their audience. It's about, there's an entirely different game going on, where science communication is a debate about the underlying models behind things. And oftentimes those models aren't even explicitly discussed in a text or a talk. They're just lying in the background somewhere. And if you can't see those different levels of things, then there's no way to write about it in a really intelligent way. And you'll be fumbling with details that don't really matter.
Yeah, there was actually a very interesting comment in the chat, I think by Graham, about differences between English and German about that. I mean, he was saying that essentially English culture tries to write to be understood, and German culture try to write to obfuscate, so and to show how clever they are, and not necessarily meant to be understood.
That's terribly important, because writers have to realize that it's not about showing people how smart you are. It's about making them think that they are smart.
Yeah, exactly. So that was exactly the point. So I think this has been a brilliant conversation, because there's a lot of themes that could be further unpacked. I mean, I think one thing that you referred to also in a previous discussion was essentially that you have to live what you write, which I think it's actually an interesting point, because you have been writing about science, but you lived a lot of science, both at the EMBL and I guess also in Berlin. So this is probably your now expert view of science, what you write. So I really look forward to it.
I meant that in two ways. The first way is that as a writer, if you're creating a scene, like in this book, I had to sometimes invent scenes. I knew that something happened, but we couldn't really construct exactly. So you have to put yourself into the mindset of your character, but you also have to put yourself into the whole body with all of your senses, smells, sounds. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, you're right that, I mean, it's a fantastic job, because I've seen the brightest spectrum of science that you can imagine. And I'm getting to hear the latest stories, the next thing that's coming all the time. And you just synthesize all of this stuff somehow. And you really, it's a story that makes sense somehow.
Yeah,
Okay,
and that makes me,
now.
you know, gets me the great segue, because you said, I mean, you have seen many types of science, and I want to bring out a very different facet of science with Andrew. Andrew is writing a book about decarbonization. So I would bring him in to discuss a little bit about his book, which is still unpublished. So I guess the first thing is learning about what it is about, and perhaps you can tell us now.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the introduction. The book is actually published now. It is available in hard copy and as an ebook and Kindle. And I know Russ very well from our days working together at the EMBL, and so I know exactly what he's talking about in terms of use of language. And another thing that I found was very useful to engage an audience is a question. So I'm going to ask you all now a question. What do you think is the largest single driver of the plans to carry out deep sea mining of minerals?
I feel at school. I don't have an answer.
Does anyone have an answer? The largest single driver of
deep
sea mining?
Angus came first, and then Benjamin came second. So I'll skip Angus, but I'll go with Benjamin. Electric cars. Angus.
Someone says batteries and electric cars. Well, in fact, if you read the literature, you'll find out that that is indeed probably the largest single driver of deep sea mining. And the thoughts that I had about this and other areas in which we are developing ways to store and distribute energy made me think, how similar to biology is it? It's not actually very similar to biology. What we humans are now doing to invent new, greener ways of managing energy, producing energy, and storing energy actually.
Oh, you stopped.
First of all, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not talking about us staying with fossil fuels. Absolutely not. We need to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. But we must also, I believe, not distance ourselves too much from the principles of biology, because biology has used carbon compounds in energy and material economies for 3.5 billion years on this planet sustainably. So I'm going to read now a little bit of my book. I'm going to start with the foreword. Carbon has gotten a very bad name, not because it's bad, but because we've taken it from sources and used it in ways that are clearly unsustainable. However, life on Earth is a massive, sustainable, carbon-based mechanism of energy and material transitions, recycling at its best. My motivation for writing this book was a growing concern that human technology development and consumption habits are taking us further and further away from the principles that have enabled life on Earth to exist sustainably for around 3.5 billion years. Instead of seeking mineral-based energy solutions, the equivalents of which create massive environmental degradation and long-term contamination of land and water, life exists in equilibrium with the inorganic Earth in a relatively thin layer at the interface between the atmosphere and the crust, the biosphere. Here it cycles carbon in integrated networks of energy and material transformations powered ultimately by the sun. We now have a very small window of opportunity to learn from biology in this respect and devise carbon-based economies on similar principles. Interestingly, this is the exact opposite of the way in which many people interpret the concept of decarbonization. We arguably have more knowledge about carbon compounds and the monitoring of carbon-based gases in our atmosphere than any other realm of chemistry. We can use this to embrace rather than reject carbon, but it, or any other solution for that matter, will only work if we greatly reduce consumption and become sensitive to feedback from our biotic and abiotic environment, just as life does. In my analysis, if we continue to distance ourselves technologically yet further from the natural world, we will reduce our chances of sustainable existence, not increase them. The largest mismatches are indeed in our economies of energy and material. The consequences of our fossil fuel dependent culture have just started to manifest themselves. There's much, much worse to come. However, if we try to solve this problem by creating new technologies that take us yet further away from natural biological economies of energy and material, we will almost certainly fail. It took me 3 years of intensive literature research and thinking to write this book, and I would like to help you take it in its most important insights quickly. Some parts are easy to read, others are inevitably considerably harder because I must make certain points with calculations, numbers, and specialist science. In the interests of economy of resources in the print edition of this book, the calculations and detail of the modeling can be found online. Conclusions and insights are in this area are available grouped according to chapter. I've given the chapters, their sections and subsections very explicit and meaningful titles in order to help readers identify and grasp high-level concepts as quickly as possible. In chapters 1 and 7, there exists a lot of complementarity, and these are the easiest to read. They essentially describe how carbon became such an important element in the universe and in life, and how human civilization can harness it sustainably. So that's the basis behind the book. And I used a very well-known and respected framework for doing my simulations and calculations and modeling on large economies of energy and material. And this is called the RECIPE framework, RECIPE, developed by the University of Amsterdam. And I have to say, I was absolutely astounded by the results that emerged from my analysis of electric vehicles compared with combustion engine vehicles running on e-fuel. So there I've mentioned the terrible word e-fuel. But in fact, if you do full chain analyses from the very beginning of the process, mining the minerals, refining them, producing the products, using the products, and then end of life, you'll find that, in fact, in environmental terms, electric vehicles have about 4 times or more the negative impact of cars running on e-fuels, so conventional cars running on e-fuels. This is something, of course, that very, very few people are able to do. But it's something for which I had 3 years, and it's just one chapter in the book. And I would like, if possible, to read just the beginning of this chapter. It's called Decarbonizing the Car, Trading Off CO2 Against Larger Environmental Problems, ? I'm devoting a whole chapter to the car because it's emblematic of seriously incomplete analyses of environmental impact in general, and because it has been distorted into a massive, unbalanced public attractor. Most overhyping relates to car usage, in contrast to car manufacture. However, car use is connected with a much smaller part of the overall carbon dioxide emissions problem than industry as a whole and agriculture, for example, sectors that less frequently enter the public consciousness via the media. A narrative has been created in which the internal combustion engine is in general greatly inferior to battery electric vehicles in terms of energy consumption and environmental impact, and that e-fuels are seen as no more than a desperate, very costly attempt to save outdated, filthy technology. However, closer and much fuller analysis shows that the truth is very different. Internal combustion engine vehicles running on e-fuels do not generally turn out to be energetically or environmentally worse and more polluting than battery electric vehicles at all.
Andrew.
Yes.
You were doing, I think you were making this point in the previous comment. So I think we understood. I had a question in general about it. I think, I think a lot of these sounds very reasonable, but it's also that ecological system based on carbon, are self-equilibrating, but they sort of don't run perhaps at human scales in some applications. So I mean, I was wondering in general, do you think there is an argument of scale? That, the scale of growth of human in terms of use of resources matters here? Because I think, a lot of the argument of the decarbonization is based on this, right? People would say, if we don't grow, we won't pollute. So, do you think it's a matter of scale, or you think scale is not important in this?
No, you're absolutely right there. It is partly a matter of scale, and which is why in my book I also say that massive reductions are necessary. I do not believe that any technology is going to be sustainable without very large changes in human behavior with the technology. And so I take your point entirely that you could argue biology does much less with carbon energy carriers than we do. But there are ways in which we can make circular economies, and they will only work, as in any area of human technology, if we consume much less.
I'd like to, sorry, I just want to come in because I think there's an interesting general point that's been raised by this, and I'd be really keen on asking the other authors as well here, which is that what Andrew, I think you've been showcasing for us is the challenge in dealing in society with complex issues. I mean, the issues you're talking about are actually complex, and as you said, most people don't have 3 years to research them and don't read all the primary literature. In this general discussion we're having today about being, a scientist, being an author, I'm really keen in hearing how you go about communicating complex ideas that rely upon a certain degree of scientific credentials or expertise to the broadest audience. Because sadly, I mean, what I've seen in popular politics recently is the winners seem to be the people who lower the arguments to the lowest common denominator. In Britain, Brexit happened, in my opinion, because the Leave campaign coined this term, take back control. And it was a 3-word, easily understood argument. And, in contrast, the people trying, including me, who were trying to make the counter arguments based on, I don't know, facts, economics, other types of arguments, were immediately drowned out. I feel Donald Trump in the US, I don't, if Chris or other people from the US are online, Donald Trump won an election, I think, by saying, make America great again. So that was 4 words. And the problem as a scientist is, how do you communicate effectively what actually really are complicated ideas when you're fighting against people for whom facts don't matter, but they just want to get the ideas? I don't know if any of Russ or Alvis or Anna could comment on that.
Well, let me just say a couple of very brief things. First of all, I think Alvis's approach to this was brilliant because he said he said he always tried to start each section with a sort of more basic level to get people into the story, and then said it's okay if you don't understand all the technical details. Managing that is a great issue, and I think that kind of approach is great. The other thing is that scientists also learned what they know from something they didn't know. So if you go back into your own learning process and try to reconstruct that and say, okay, how did I assemble this complicated thing in my head? There's some ways to use that to actually write about it or talk about it. The other thing I want to say here is, for me, it always starts with being very clear in your own mind. And Andrew's taken another step to me, which sounds like a different sort of genre, which is science advocacy, advocating a particular position, and I think that's tricky because the models keep changing, and we're at this moment in time where we can measure these things, and that's fine, and we really don't know how things will evolve or whatever. But you have to be really careful with that. For example, Michael Crichton, just before he died, he wrote this entirely long novel on climate change, where he's basically a climate change denier. And it looks scientific because there were lots of footnotes and references to Science magazine in it and everything. And so people also respond to kind of a scientific register in weird ways sometimes. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's perfectly okay to tell the part of the story that you can and say, okay, here's this more complicated part for the experts. But to try to do both things at the same time and manage that, I think is a great thing to try to do. I don't know if I really answered the question, but
I don't know if Alvis or Anna would like to comment.
If I can chip in, Albert Einstein has said that things have to be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I completely agree with Russ that first of all, is to get things clear in your own mind, really, and then to be honest. And usually the most kind of fundamental questions are not that complicated. There are some which are, but very, very often, if you really kind of are clear in your own mind, you can explain quite complex things simply. But you need to be honest, really. I think that's perhaps when it kind of, my book, I don't think in my book I'm touching, kind of almost intentionally, I'm not touching too many kind of, well, no, they are scientifically controversial issues, but they're nothing like kind of decarbonization, which is politically, well, kind of, some would say controversial, really. And when reading about this kind of more politically controversial issues, what I'm struggling is that not always people are fully honest, really. I think you have to be fully honest, even when things sometimes are kind of not helping you. You still need to kind of talk about that. I think that I think is the trick, how you get over thinking public as opposed to people who only want to get brief slogans.
I think that making it simple, it's one thing, but it's also good to refer to experiences that people have from everyday life. So that's what I try to do when I write, especially popular science articles for adults, not for children, to refer to the experiences and their own what they can encounter in their real life. That the science is not somewhere else, but it's and from the biology perspective, it's in us. That we are biological creatures. We have those cells in our veins and in our skin. So that's important part to make them aware of this, that it's not somewhere there. And that's one thing. And also, as Russ said, it's very important to bring literature to science. That's also something we should try to like introduce scientific concepts with the stories of people and from real life, and how, for example, how the discoveries were made based on experiences and the histories of real people.
Yeah, I think this is also
one more thing. There's a great example of this, and that was when the Centers for Disease Control were making their first studies of the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. They did a cluster study and they held a press conference in which they gave the results. And the way that they explained things, no single person in the room went away with any understanding of what they'd done. A cluster study is a super intuitive thing. People in the Middle Ages did something like a cluster study, and a lot of sciences actually, there are everyday correlates to it, which you can use, and like, just basic principles like local causation or like one state arises from the next state. Everybody uses those things constantly in their daily lives, so you can draw on that to build more complex scientific stories.
Sorry. Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, disease is actually what would actually be done with kids, right? I mean, with kids, you go with example and experiences first. So I guess, Anna, this applies also to the type of book that you were writing, where you start from examples of experience, because people need to relate, essentially, to understand, I guess.
So,
yes, exactly.
So one prediction at the start has sort of come true, which is looking at the clock, we're almost out of time, and the sort of 90 minutes have flown past, which is always a great sign. There's clearly a lot of different subjects that have been brought up, and I think Andrew's topic of decarbonization and the relative merits of different strategies could be a very important topic in its own right for a future discussion, where we could look at that in more detail. But just as a concluding point, can I just invite each of the contributors today in like a sentence or so to finish off, for people like Thomas and I and the other people who will watch the video or have been online who haven't been brave enough, I believe so far, to write a popular science book. What advice can you give us about finding a publisher or how to go about it? So maybe if we just do it in the order people speak. So Anna, what would be your advice to us?
In case of the book, the publisher found me. But in case of the articles, when I started to write popular science articles, I just wrote to every single magazine. I wrote an article and I sent it out to every single journal that would potentially publish it. And one responded. And ever since we have a collaboration. So it's just a trial. You have to write something that you think is good, that you wanted to convey this story for a longer time, and just be persistent. It took months for me to find this first magazine that would be interested, that would reply to me, and then we would work more on the article together and make it a printable version. So it's persistence.
Persistence, yes. And in fact, I remember reading that J.K. Rowling sent the first copy of her draft of Harry Potter to multiple publishers who all turned it down, and showed that similar sort of expertise as many of the referees and editors of my scientific publications when they respond. So I think, yeah, persistence. Alvis, how did you find a publisher?
Yeah, so first of all, I read a good book, which is called How to Write a Book Proposal, when I was ready to go to the publisher. Then the second thing I think, which is very important, is look through, find the books which are similar to the ones you are planning to write, and look who has published them, and then write to them and persistent.
Russ?
Relationships help. So this can be very political. So if you go in cold, like kind of Anna did, that's a lot of work, and it can work out. In the modern market, depending on what kind of book it is, things are so competitive that you're expected to know the market, like what Alvis was talking about. Publishers, there are good models out there. Everyone has a story to tell. So but I would personally advise fairly early in the process, get a couple chapters written or whatever, show them to people, and at that point, try to get a publisher involved early in the process. And it should be a publisher who's not going to totally screw your concept or take it off in a direction. You know, they don't sign the Hollywood deal with the screenwriters before you have your book written.
Okay, and Andrew,
what's going to happen?
Mine's a kind of follow-up on Alvis's point that you should become familiar with what your preferred publisher has published in that area, so you know that they do publish in that area. And then you have to try to distinguish your book as much as possible so that they realize it's something new, different, and interesting.
Okay, that's great advice. I think this is something that we definitely will want to follow up on again in future, and perhaps help some of us and some of the members of the alumni community to achieve their aspirations of being able to write a book. So I very much hope that you'll continue to help us with advice that our speakers today. And I'd like, on behalf of the whole alumni community, to thank all our speakers today, Anna, Alvis, Russ, and Andrew, and everyone who took part today, and also everyone who's taken part throughout the last year in the Coffee with EMBL events and in supporting the Alumni Association. I think we are looking ahead to next year as a very special big year for the 50th anniversary. We have a lot of plans, and we look forward to your continued support and participation in the events in the year ahead. And I personally would like to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and a very prosperous and successful 2024. Thank you.
Happy holidays. Happy holidays to everybody.